free speech is the kind of thing that gets dominated by right-wingers, whereas free speech for us in the theatre, I wrote an article a few years ago for this culturematters.org.uk talking about like censorship in the theatre or censorship of ideas and how that happens in three main ways. You know, there was very explicit censorship in the theatre until, the late 60s. Self-censorship. People will change the things that they might want to put on to be something that is more likely to get on in the first place. And a systemic filtering. Often there is no need for self-censorship. We can follow a similar line of argument to that used by the anarchist intellectual Noam Chomsky in 1996.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Even when work gives the appearance of radicalism, its rarity and novelty can be tolerated and probably enjoyed by the establishment. It's almost like in those bourgeois spaces, people who are, in very kind of elite positions in society, they can't be hurt by any of the criticism. As Frank Arame, the Marxist feminist theatre maker, noted in 1969, we had realised that despite the hostilities of a few obtuse reactionaries, the high bourgeoisie reacted to our spankings almost with pleasure. Masochists? No. Without us realising it, we were helping their digestion. Our whipping boosted their blood circulation like some good birching after a refreshing sauna. This bourgeoisie did not mind our criticism, no matter how pitiless it had become, but only so long as the exposure of their vices occurred exclusively within the structures that they controlled. I think she's absolutely nailed it there, that people can watch a load of this criticism at them, and as long as it's within places that they own or they feel so comfortable in, they can hear a load of criticism and be like, ha ha ha, classic me. But yeah, that's not to then be a total pessimist about it. And so I said, so what is to be done? Though Frank Arame's point might seem nihilistic, like I was saying, we just need to make sure that we focus our energy in more effective ways. Theatre is really fun to make, and that's a fantastic reason to do it. But let's not trick ourselves into thinking we are challenging the powerful rather than boosting their blood circulation. The most effective ways for us to make the real structural changes we want will be through our targeted collective efforts as workers and activists. We need to change who owns, influences, dominates, participates and feels comfortable in our theatre spaces. And I think there are two strands to this project. The first one being funding and ownership, and the second being workforce reform. I'm not sure about that now. Building worker power is the one that I would say now. On the first one, funding and ownership, I mean, it's so tricky talking about any of this at a time where the Tories are cutting cultural funding big time and, they are engaging in class war really, really effectively. They are trying to make the powerful more powerful, and they are trying to make sure that the less powerful are even less powerful. So that's why they're so anti-trade union, because that is worker power being effectively organised, and they want to crush it as much as possible, as they have consistently done. Since Thatcher, they've just been absolutely incredible. I mean, the Tories have always been against working class power, but they've just been so effective since Thatcher at suppressing it and creating a new kind of a new world of neoliberalism that's all about the self and all about like individuals as opposed to thinking as a class of people. So yeah, the funding and ownership, I mean, we need to drastically change. And there was this good, what have I referenced here? Exciting work has already been done on this by the Movement for Cultural Democracy, which came out of the World Transform Festival in 2017. They did some like absolutely great work. The hope was that some of this stuff could be implemented by a Labour government if it could come in. That is unlikely to happen under Keir Starmer. Any of the reforms he will do will be very, very minor and absolutely not challenge capital or challenge any of the sort of any power structure at all. It will just be a sort of a fairer status quo is the thing that he's kind of going for, which is just awful in this time where we need such massive changes. Oh, there's one good little fact here, which is when it comes to public funding for the arts, we need to shout about the fact that this country is a sham. Oh, God. Arts Council England's total budget is comparable to the city of Berlin's culture budget. Yes, you read that correctly. One German city's culture budget is approximately equal to ACE's total budget. ACE being Arts Council England. Like I said, it's a sham. We need to demand a drastic increase in funding rather than relentlessly competing for scraps. Yeah! which is all true. I'm just like, that's not going to happen through the Conservative government, is it? Unless we can create incredible power through the trade unions. That is certainly what we've been trying to do with equity, is to be able to strengthen the workforce as much as possible so that we can then make some changes. Whether we can make changes to the Arts Council or not, I'm not sure, but worth a try in it. And then this second one, workforce reform. What am I on about here? I say transforming our workforce so that it better represents our societies. This requires us to see our industry as part of a greater political ecology. Ooh. So that we can see a lack of diversity as a problem forged outside of the theatre due to the systemic economic oppression of working class people, disproportionately people of colour, disproportionately women, rather than this being solely the fault of gatekeepers. I mean, I do agree with that very much so still. I think there's way too much emphasis that's put onto gatekeepers, whether that's casting directors or directors, as opposed to on the systems that produce limited resources that then mean that they are then gate kept. If that makes sense. So the only reason there is gatekeeping to be done is because there are limited resources, limited jobs, limited access to space and resources. So if we had a radically different society that wasn't geared towards profit and was instead geared towards people thriving, we'd have a very different system. But under this system, we have gatekeepers. And then I feel like there's lots of often I think quite individualistic criticism of gatekeepers, where people are often just annoyed that they didn't get a job or that they aren't as successful as they would want to be, as opposed to that the system is inherently unfair or flawed or whatever. I mean, the system is inherently unfair and flawed, but that's, I would say, more to do with the system of capitalism. It's not something that's unique to the theatre. Anyway, I'll carry on. We need to stop using a definition of class as merely having an accent or as a dog whistle code word for white working class. See Ash Sarkar's piece, The Working Class Isn't As White As Some Would Like You to Think, which is a great piece. And instead talk about class as your material conditions, access to capital, financial precarity, etc. The things that determine how soon you might be forced to quit when work is too scarce, or whether you would even dream on embarking on such a precarious line of work in the first place. Working class underrepresentation won't be solved by getting a few more working class people into the industry while leaving the structural barriers to entry and longevity unchanged. Currently, only 2% of actors make a living from acting, and this includes TV, film, radio, adverts, etc. And without a dramatic increase in funding, it is unlikely to go much higher than that. I think that's currently only 2% of actors make a living solely from acting. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with this at all. The thing about a lot of representation politics is that it ends up being very limited, because getting more people from working class backgrounds into those positions doesn't necessarily do anything, because their class position changes as they get richer and more powerful. So it's not necessarily useful to think in those terms by any means, just getting people up there. It's like, well, we need to attack the barriers. And personally, I think if you start looking at the barriers more and more closely, that means, being an anti-capitalist, being a socialist, being a communist, being a very active trade unionist. I said, theatre maker Mike Bradwell said that in the 1970s, the biggest funder of the arts was not the Arts Council, but the dole. Bradwell and his gang managed to set up Hull Truck Theatre Company while on benefits, because the much more generous and much less sanctioned dole of the time meant they didn't have to work other jobs or starve to make their work, which, people do now, or they, end up having to quit. With half of most people's pay packets going on rent, we should be calling on our unions and political parties to have a strong policy on rent caps, a huge increase in house building, expanding tenants' rights, and resistance to gentrification. We should be demanding increased benefits and an end to DWP sanctions, as well as an increase in mandatory living wage for all. Sure. Agree with all that. And actually, I think that housing rights would, it would transform most people trying to work in the arts' lives. I think that would be more significant than anything else. And it's funny, just to go back to the original point about free speech. If people really actually cared about free speech, then that would mean also caring about people's precarity. Because if you're very, very precariously employed, you're not going to then so freely speak out against your employer or say things that might seem controversial or whatever it is. Whereas if we had, if people's outgoings were a lot less, like I said here, half of most people's pay packets goes on rent. Certainly true for me. And I just think, people are going to be less likely to take risks or say what they really think or try to make work that is explicitly anti-government or anti-theatre industry itself or whatever, if they're just, always worried about making enough money to pay their rent and pay their bills, which have skyrocketed with the cost of living crisis. Yeah, I think this is absolutely true. And if anything, precarious housing is could be easily described as a free speech issue as well, because it holds people back. It's one of the barriers, as opposed to the very boring way that the right speak about free speech, which is, them being called mean by someone on Twitter. Anyway, I'll finish up. This is almost done. These far-reaching struggles to reduce living costs and improve the material conditions of the majority of people could be our means to a drastically more diverse theatre. We might have theatre spaces owned by the many rather than the few. Those are the days when I said things like that. With a representative workforce who, with reduced living costs, would have a greater chance to imagine, to write, to devise, rather than only those with the luxury of financial security. True. We might be able to produce more work that can entertain and galvanise communities rather than provide some good birching for the bourgeoisie. Our work might be more radical and more confrontational with the forces of wealth and privilege that have so far limited or shut down its potency. There is a lot to be done, no more tinkering. Yeah, that's quite good, actually. But the addition I would make is that I think the thing that we should definitely be looking at with our work is how is it empowering our communities? John McGrath's book, A Good Night Out, deals with this. In fact, it's really good. Definitely read it if you can. Because he talks about how the spaces themselves are paramount, above everything else. So doing, back then there was more prevalence of working men's clubs and, those kinds of very old school social spaces that were by and for communities. In there, you get a very different audience and a very different vibe, and you can say very different things. So that's probably it, I think. I hope this was fun. If not, sorry. But yeah, I'm going to do more of these soon. God bless you, comrades, and I'll see you soon. Mwah.